Hi, everybody. My name is Nina Boski, as you may know, and with me is Gary Vitacco Robles. He's a mental health professional, and he'll get into that just a little bit when we get to hear from him. But he wrote the book, the volumes 1 and 2, Icon, the films, the life, and times of Marilyn Monroe. It's one of the most in-depth biographies that is out there, and he's a wealth of information. I think it was Leslie Kaspirowitz from Marilyn Remembered that said you are an encyclopedia when it comes to Marilyn, and he's certainly my go-to guy when I always say, hey Gary, did this really happen, right? And he'll give me the wealth of what happened to Marilyn.
You're very kind, Nina.
Well, and Gary, you know, you're such a warm and kind human being that I can't think of anyone that Marilyn herself would be just in awe and honored to have you write about her and contribute to her life and her legacy as you do. So I just want to say thank you, and I'm sure all the Marilyn fans want to thank you as well.
I really wanted to give Marilyn a voice because so often her voice is not heard. We hear the voices of her biographers and not her.
Well, this series, it's a 5-part series. We may even give you some bonus rounds during this month, but we're scheduled to give you 5 series every Wednesday at 12 noon Pacific Coast time. And this week, we are talking about sexual and physical abuse as it relates to mental illness and addiction. And we're doing this series this month because it's Mental Health Awareness Month. And we really want to be able to bring to light not only Marilyn's true life story, but also to help you, the viewer that may be dealing with mental illness or addiction yourself, or you have a loved one that is dealing with it. So specifically today, we're going to get into the sexual and physical abuse of Marilyn. And, you know, some of this content is going to be potentially sensitive and difficult to hear. But I also think that it's really important that we take the stigma, we take the shame, and we start giving resources and the ability that if anybody is watching this today, that they may want to get help. And you know, Gary, you know this better than anybody, that back in Marilyn's time, she was one of the first people to bring it up, but it wasn't talked about back then, and it certainly wasn't dealt with. So let's get into what's going on in terms of physical and sexual abuse and trauma right now, and some of the statistics that we're looking at.
Well, Marilyn Monroe was really the first public figure to publicly disclose that she had been sexually abused as a child. And this was, of course, during a time in our history in the 50s when these topics were taboo. We did not discuss it. We denied the existence of these things. But the staggering statistics are that 1 in 4 female children are sexually abused by the age of 16. So if you were to bring...
Whoa. Did you say 1 in 4?
1 in 4.
Wow.
Yeah. So if you were to bring into a room 100 females, 25 of them will have experienced sexual abuse before the age of 16. Ooh, that's a huge proportion of women. And for men, it's 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused before the age of 16 as well.
Wow, 1 in 6. So that's... yeah, that's
significant, very significant. And you know, these are statistics that we have now, but when we do retrospective studies, we learn that the frequency and the prevalence of sexual abuse back in the days that Marilyn experienced it during the Depression in the 30s, it's no more prevalent then as it was now. So the same numbers of people experienced then as do now.
So Gary, what in the world is going on? Because back in 1962, they weren't talking about it. But here in 2019, people are talking about it. There are resources. Absolutely. Why are we still at the same place? That's staggering to me that we have all these resources. We have the ability to get help. What's going on, do you think?
Well, we're not adequately protecting our children, and a huge piece of this is the fact that sexual abuse is intergenerational. So if you have a child who's sexually abused, it increases that child's risk of then having children who are sexually abused. So it's a cycle that just perpetuates generation after generation, and it's a cycle that has to be ended. But it's very challenging for a parent who is triggered and coping with their own childhood abuse to be able to look for the signs and to prevent it from happening to their own children. And so the more information that we have available, the more people can heal, the more they can help to protect their own children. We owe a lot to the women's movement in the late 60s and early 70s to begin to discuss this more openly. And, you know, that was now almost 50 years ago. Now we have.
I think you bring a good point up, though. When you haven't dealt with it yourself, it's going to be really difficult for you to help and support your children or loved one that may be dealing with it as well.
And you have to have the insight to do that. And often it's something that requires the assistance of a professional who can help one navigate through this. This is very challenging for someone to navigate on their own, especially if sexual abuse might have been something that they thought was normal in their own childhood because they didn't know any other experience but the experience of their own trauma.
And I want to also just back up the truck a little bit, because many of you know Gary as the biographer of Icon, but he's much more than a biographer. And talk to people a little bit about what your background is, because I say mental health professional, but some people don't know what does that mean in regards to some of your work that you're doing, because it gives you a voice to be able to really speak to this.
Yeah, I'm licensed in Florida as a licensed mental health therapist, and I'm also a national certified counselor. But my clinical experience goes back a little bit more than 25 years ago when, as a therapist, I was trained in trauma-informed care in the early 90s. And the first population that I worked with were children in the foster care system who had survived sexual abuse, physical abuse, and neglect. And we were beginning to know a lot more about how that impacts development and brain development. And there were interventions for the children and their families. And so when a child is hurt, everybody else in the family is hurt. And not only does the child need treatment, but the other family members need assistance in coping with their own reactions so they can be productive and help their own children heal. So
there's a term in what you're talking about that, you know, when you say about, you know, helping the children heal, is that with parents and with just anybody, I think it's an AA term, but you're as sick as your secrets. And because there's so much shame, what do you think is happening to, you know, in terms of, you know, with your background and what you were dealing with, especially with the foster care? How do you protect people that are going through something like this when the system itself seems very broken, at least in my opinion?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, that's the biggest challenge, and if we could solve that challenge, we would solve all of the problems. But I mean, children are often removed from abusive environments, and then they're placed in other environments where they're abused again, which was definitely Marilyn Monroe's experience. So we haven't figured out how to effectively keep children safe. There's another aspect of this, which is abuse reactivity. So children who have been sexualized as in their youth, they might go on to act out that abuse with other children. And, you know, there's a difference between what's natural sexual exploration in childhood, because that is something that indeed happens. But it happens when children are kind of engaging in this sexual exploration together as equals. It's playful. No one is being forced or hurt. And so, you know, adults still need to supervise their children and place boundaries on these behaviors. But it is normal and natural for children to explore. But for a child who has been sexually abused and sexualized, it's different. It's a sexual reactivity. So they might be, you know, recapitulating their abuse through acting out with other children who are then now exposed to this behavior. And it's not exploration anymore. So, you know, supervision of children is just so important. We live in a world that can be extremely dangerous. And unfortunately, the people who abuse our children are not really the strangers. In order to gain the trust of a child or gain the trust of their family, to get close enough to them, to groom them, which is the kind of the insidious process by which an offender will engage a child in sexual abuse, you have to be close enough to that child. And so it's often a very close friend or even a family member. And then when it's a family member, you're dealing with the topic of incest, which is a different dynamic, because the relationship between family and child is supposed to be protector and safe person. And now when that person is the offender, that creates dynamics that are horribly damaging to children, especially when it's in the context of a relationship, a family relationship where there's positive and negative aspects. So the person who was abusive might have also shown love and cared for that child. Those situations are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So it becomes extremely confusing now to the child.
Well, and we have a question from Diane. And Diane has said that she was, I'm just going to paraphrase it because she goes into quite detail, but she basically said that she was abused, and she's still dealing with it today, and she hasn't been able to tell her mother. What would you say to somebody, I changed her name, Diane, that is still having a hard time dealing with it and being able to tell a loved one? And now she says that she's 24, so she's 24, so she's just into young adulthood.
Well, my heart goes out to Diane, who's struggling with this, and here is I don't know Diane's situation, but if the offender was someone close to the family or close to the mother, you can see why it would be so challenging to talk about the experience, because now it's going to disrupt everything within that family. It could be the mother's husband, former husband, partner, brother, relative, member of the household. And so the journey.
And she does say this in the letter that or email that she wrote us, basically said that it's a friend of the family. So she has not had the courage yet to speak to her mother, and she can't sleep. It's getting worse, she said, and she's got a lot of anxiety. So I would imagine that the more you don't deal with it, the higher the anxiety gets.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's like a balloon. Imagine a balloon that, as the secret goes on, the balloon gets bigger and bigger and bigger and just follows the person around as a burden. So there's a hierarchy of disclosure, and so it might be safer for Diane to talk to someone who is objective and outside of the family. So if Diane can link to a crisis hotline or a mental health professional where she can share this information, knowing that there's not going to be a crisis within the family relationship, so that she can gain the skills to be able to disclose her story in an environment where she's going to be supported and where she's going to understand that it wasn't her fault and it was the responsibility of the offender and not her, in that safe environment. Then her mother can be invited into that as family therapy, and then a professional can help facilitate that conversation between Diane and her mom. Or Diane might feel that she can do that on her own with the support of a counselor. But those are things that she can explore in her own safe therapy with someone who will hold her confidence.
Gary, because this is such a big topic, we're going to give within this series several parts to this today. And there's one other question before we move to part 2 of this topic around sexual abuse and physical abuse, as it not only relates to Marilyn, but somebody else that may be dealing with it. I know somebody that actually has been sexually abused in her family from her grandfather, and her sibling completely denies it and says it did not happen. Do you find in your work that happens quite a bit? One of the family members comes forward and the rest of the family, or at least one family member, says absolutely not, and they're actually at odds?
Unfortunately, yes, that's very common. You know, it can go many ways. You know, sometimes when one person speaks out, they might think that they were the only one that this happened to, and when they begin to talk about it, it kind of makes it safe and okay for other family members to begin to disclose that indeed it happened to them as well. And so in that type of a situation, there could be support of all of these victimized folks so that they can heal together and have validation with their similar experiences. But there might be others in the family who are not ready to face what happened to them, or if it didn't happen to them, there's just a lot of defenses around naming an offender.
Yeah,
These are
especially if
families,
it's a loved one, like a
and
grandfather.
sometimes these issues break families apart. And so many folks keep the secret because they don't want to alienate their family. They don't want to be an outcast of the family. So they hold on to this heavy secret at their own emotional, physical expense, just so that the family doesn't break apart. And so, you know, folks have to work toward their own truth. And sometimes their own truth invites the support of other people, and sometimes it alienates those folks. And those are heavy conversations, heavy consequences, and it puts a lot of responsibility on the survivor, and they're the resilient one who got through it and they survived, and now they're dealing with all of the fallout. And so that's why professional help is so necessary sometimes to navigate through all of those challenges. And I can tell you there's been, you know, many examples of how there's success for families in being able to speak to the truth and identify the offender. Offenders can get support. Offenders can break their own cycle, and families can heal. I did a lot of work with youth who had sexual behavior problems, who might have offended against siblings and other relatives. And those families, when everybody's getting the support and the treatment and making progress, you can bring people together, and offenders can take responsibility for what they did, their actions, and families could go on to heal. That isn't to say that some folks are going to escape legal consequences, or that they're going to have unsupervised contact with children in the family now that this is known, because then, you know, that increases the risk for other children to be hurt. So other boundaries and safety measures have to be put in place. But I can tell you from my own experiences that families can come together and heal from this. Life might be very different after this than before, but it can certainly be healthier.
Well, and it's interesting you said heal from it, and this vodcast is being posted on American Icon, where healing meets life. And you know, this is a sensitive subject, and both you and I are taking this and hoping, our intention is that you can begin, if you are dealing with it yourself, or you know a loved one, or maybe you are the one that actually has been perpetuating this abuse because you've had it yourself, and now you're doing it to somebody else. I think this is a great awareness and wake up call for people to not look at it as so much shame, but there's a lot of resource and help and healing that can come, and a lot of support to help you do that, especially if you feel like you're alone. So what I'd like to do now is we are going to finish this part of the series. We're going to go to part 2, and we're breaking it up just so that you have some time to digest some of the stuff that's being said. In our next segment, part of this series, we're going to get specifically into Marilyn's life and specifically what happened to her. And part of the reason why we're bringing this forward is it gets glossed over in biographies. And the second reason why we're doing this is that if you can see that somebody that really did survive, even though her life ended in tragedy, she did survive and was able to bring forth her vision in such a huge way, that sexual and physical abuse that you may not even be aware of as a Marilyn fan. So we'll be back in just a moment if you want to go on to part 2 and really look into the life of Marilyn Monroe realistically and truthfully. We'll be back in just a moment.